All right, so I've got my document. I've already put in the right units of measurement. And to put in columns, I'm going to go to Layout and Margins and Columns. And if you keep the preview button selected, then you can actually see what's happening as you make the changes. By default, you just have this one column, and the columns are denoted by this pink and purple line. So let's say I want to follow the grid structure that they have on here. And they've got 4 rows, or sorry, 4 columns. So I'm going to go ahead and put in 4 columns. The gutter is the space between each column. Generally speaking, you want that gutter to be there so that if you had big blocks of text, there would be some space between each block of text horizontally. Because if that weren't there, then you'd have 2 blocks of text right up against one another, and it'd be tough to decipher one line of text from another line of text in a completely different column. So right now that gutter is pretty thin. I'm going to go ahead and make it 2 pica, and then the margin on here is the margin, obviously kind of like the padding in a web design between, that might be the area where your text can go no farther than. So just like if you had a page in a book, you've got this area called the gutter. You wouldn't want to have any imperative information in the gutter because then you're probably not going to see it. Same deal with having a margin around your composition. If you have anything too close to the edge that needs to be read, like a block of text like this, there's a chance it might get cut off or that it might create some visual tension because it's so close to the edge. So anything that's really important, like a big block of text, you don't want it too close to the edge. The margin, in this case, just depends on what you want to do. So right now it's set to 1/2 inch, more or less. If I want to, maybe I want an entire inch worth of padding all the way around. So I've got that set up. Then what I'm going to do, I'm actually going to go up, let me change this. In InDesign, you've got something called your master pages. These are your templates. It's the page that sets up everything that's going to be used in your subsequent pages. So I'm going to adjust this so I don't have 2 pages. So actually when I do the margins and column adjustments, I want to do this in the master page. You can do it to the individual pages, but it's good to get in the habit of doing it on the master page so that way if you do make a change, it gets applied to all the pages that use that master. And I'll know when the master has been applied. It's a little tough to see, but there's a little A at the top of this icon for page number 1 that lets me know that the master A has been applied to this layout. But what I'm going to do from here is I'm going to start making other divisions to make rows in here. And the way I'll typically do that is actually using some shapes and kind of break them down. So I'm going to draw a rectangle, and I'm going to bring down some guides to where the center of the rectangle is and then build up gutters and all that kind of stuff. So just like in Illustrator or Photoshop, if you go to one of the rulers at the top of the window, you can click and drag down a guide. and it should just kind of click into place. So that's where the center of this poster is. And then for the gutter, I want the gutter to be 2 pica like I have for the gutter of the columns. So I'm going to choose the rectangle tool again and just click once and then put in my measurements, and it'll give me a 2 pica box. And then that'll give me that first division. So I've already split this in half with a nice gutter to kind of pad the separation of the rows. And I would do the same thing here. So I've got another row division. And just to continue it, I'm going to do one more set of rows. So I'm just going to put these to the side. And now all of these units, if I did this right, and I did, yes, these should all be the same size. So now I've got kind of a grid laid out. I've got the vertical columns and I've got the horizontal rows. Did you have a question? So this is just, it was originally a larger one. There's a box, a rectangle tool, a shape tool on the toolbar, just like in Illustrator. So you can click on that and just click and drag. And what I did was I first made a long rectangle to make, to fit into that column that I had. And then if you've got, if you go to grids and guides and you have the snap to guides option selected and also smart guide selected, it'll automatically snap to different points and objects that you already have. So that way when I put in an object and I want to put in a guide right at the center point, it'll just click there. It makes things really easy. So pretty much what I did is I would put down a guide at the halfway point based on this rectangle, and then use this 2 pica square centered it on that guide I just made, and then put a new guide above it and a new guide below it. And then I would go back to this rectangle, move it up to that uppermost guide, and then get a new center point, drag a guide down, move the 2 pica box to the center of it, put a guide above it, below it, shrink this to the top of that guide I just made, and then do the same thing. Center guide, 2 pica box, upper guide, lower guide. And then just did that for every half that I made until I get all of the units that I want. So really being able to make the columns like this in InDesign, it's still a complicated process when you have to do the rows, but it's a lot quicker than doing it in Illustrator. Since all of this is in my master page, when I go to my actual page down here, all of those guides are there automatically. And the real beauty of it is I can drag my mouse over it and I can't move them. So that means I can work in this page and not have to worry about messing anything up. If I wanted to, I could even put in a shape. Let's say I want a circle that I want to put down and I know I don't want to move it. I could put this down, have it in my page, and I can't do anything to it. So by having these guides here, it makes it easier to start to flow in different parts. Now when I talk about the grid, and hopefully once I can get this chapter from this book uploaded, you'll see that the grid is really more about placing imperative information, especially relative to text. I mentioned that you can use shapes like general geometric shapes and also any shapes that you make based off of your type. Things like that, I want you to think more about where those are being placed in the larger scheme. So let's say this is your poster. You've got your grid system determined. One of the first things you want to start figuring out is where your type is going to go. So obviously you have to think about a headline, and then you've got your type specimen, so the alphabet, all of the characters, uppercase and lowercase. And then you've also got your paragraph that you're working with. So that's 3 elements of type that you have to have. Now, your headline is obviously going to be the largest element of type, or at least the first thing that people see. The next thing, your type specimen, this you'd want large enough so that people can actually see the letter forms and understand how each one is different. And then you've got your paragraph text. That could possibly be either the same size, more than likely smaller than the type you're using for your type specimen. So in terms of hierarchy, I would think about it in these steps. So you've got 1, 2, and 3. And when you start gridding this out in your thumbnails, you can start thinking about your headline. Let's say it's the name of the typeface or the typographer. Think about that as one big chunk of text. And maybe that fits in 2 columns. And when we draw in text, depending on the size, you can either just block it out like this as a general shape, or you could actually write it out. So if I'm doing Helvetica, I could actually write it out because it's obviously a lot larger than other elements. The type specimen, I know that type is going to be a little bit larger, but maybe I want to kind of have that separated each into their own columns. So maybe I have uppercase letter forms in one column, lowercase in the other. Same deal though, I'm kind of just fleshing it out right now in these little boxes. So you don't have to go in with your thumbnails and draw out A, B, C, D, that's ridiculous. Your thumbnails are only going to be like this big, so just generalize those blocks of those lines of type into rectangles like this. Then paragraph text, maybe I want to still have it in one column, but I can show these as even thinner lines because that type is going to be smaller. Then you start to realize, okay, what spaces do I have to work with in here? You don't necessarily have to fill in all of the blank spaces. Remember, just like our compositions, the 6 compositions we did at the beginning of the semester, you want to think about the way the reader views the whole composition. So what does the viewer see first? What do they see second? What does they see third? And then any additional elements you add, what are they actually adding? So maybe there's a letter that you think is really unique and you want to highlight it. And I've got this space right here to work with. Maybe I decide to have the Helvetica A put into this space. And probably should be moved over more. Not the best A, but you get the idea. Maybe I decide to amplify one of those letters so you can actually see all of the parts of it that are unique to this typeface. But what you'll notice, even though I'm just using red and black right now, by having this letter in red, and let's say the rest of my composition is maybe a slightly darker red, the difference in color will make this flatten out. It won't seem as prominent in the composition as what I have in black right now. So that's where the color comes in, and thinking about what elements are what colors, or what's white on a darker background, what's black on a lighter background, really come into play. But by having the grid, it'll help you figure out where the type goes. And you don't even have to have all the type necessarily reading in this way. Maybe you discover the time period your typographer worked in, they were really into the Swiss design and maybe even a bit of Dadaism. So maybe they tried some design compositions where the type was put at angles. Even something like this, there's still a grid structure involved. So I could still lay this out into columns, it's just tilted a different way. Maybe your typographer really used display type as image. And maybe some of the headline text is actually turned on its side, turned 90 degrees. And then some of the type is going perpendicular to it. So this is where really studying your typographer, the time period in which they were designing, or their design sensibility comes into play. When we look at these posters, we want to not only understand your typeface, but understand what it was used for and how the typographer might have done his or her work. And the idea is to kind of use some of the design inspiration, but come up with your own interpretation of it. So it's going to be a combination of your research and your own creative ability. Now, if you did do a grid like this and you wanted to skew it a little bit, I would recommend still starting off with a standard grid structure like this and then turning everything towards the end. So you're still basing everything off of a nice structure and then you're just tilting it. Unfortunately, in InDesign, you can't tilt your grids like this. You can do it in Illustrator though, so that's what I'll do next. I'll show you how to do some of this in Illustrator. Are there any questions about this though? Okay. And very importantly, I'm going to save this. So let's see. All right, so in Illustrator, new document, similar to what we did in InDesign. Under the new document profile, you can choose print, and it'll automatically put things into points. To make it a little easier, you probably want to put it into pica or inches, but I'd like you guys to try working with pica so that you can start understanding how it works. Change that, just like in InDesign, you can put in inches and it'll automatically convert it. You just have to make sure you either put the tick marks or type in IN or inches, otherwise it won't know that you're trying to convert it. You can put in the bleed. I'll do 6 like I did before. I think that's what I did before. The rest of this you want to keep the same. So we're working in CMYK, 300 DPI, so that all looks good. So it'll give me my artboard. I'm just working with the one, but the beauty of Illustrator is you could have like 6 artboards at once. So if you, for example, you guys are actually going to be doing 3 poster ideas. So actually what I'll do is I'll go ahead and add in some more artboards. There's actually this artboard tool in Illustrator. So if you forgot to add more artboards when you first made the document, you can click on the artboard tool and you can duplicate an artboard just like you would an object. So by holding down Option and also holding down Shift, I can just duplicate this artboard over. I'll do it one more time, so I have 3. And then I click back on any other tool and I get out of that option. To bring up my ruler, I'm going to do Command R. And the thing with Illustrator is you're going to have to do a little bit more math to figure out your divisions and everything. So from the conversion I made earlier, I get that this is 78. Drag over some guides to get my margin. I had 6 pica in the other one. I'm going to drag down guides to do the same thing with this one. So those are my margins, and then to figure out the columns and rows, I'll do the same thing, except what I did in InDesign I have to do for the rows and the columns instead of just one. because I can't make columns like I did in the other program. So I'm going to start off with just a black rectangle. It doesn't really matter the height of it, I just am working with the width right now. And just like before, I'm going to make sure that my smart guides are on. So that way, when I bring in new guides, it automatically, hold on, it should be just clicking to the guides. Oh yeah, snap to point, that's on. So I've got that center point, and then I'm going to make a box just like I did before, 2 pica by 2 pica. And I'm going to make my first set of columns with the gutter. Just like before, I'm going to bring this shape in to the leftmost guide. Bring this center guide to make my next set of columns. Drag that shape over to the other side. And just do the same thing again. Alright, so I've got my columns. Then for the rows, do the exact same thing that I did in InDesign. So I'm going to make this a long rectangle. Drag down a guide to the center. And then make my gutter. Divide this one in half and just do the same thing. And I won't do all the tiny divisions that I did on the other one because you get the idea. But if I want to make things a little easier to see, I can delete these guides dividing the gutters. And And I have the guides unlocked, so that's how I can delete them. And then when I have everything where I want it, I'll go back and do lock guides. So now I can't move them. Now from here, there's several different things I can do. You can make guides off of anything that you put, any type of object that you put into Illustrator. So if I wanted to, I could go ahead and kind of make these little rectangles to show generally where different areas are. And then I could go over to these other artboards. I'll do each one a little differently so you can see how it works. But I'm just going to go ahead and put in my margins. But I could bring these shapes over to my second artboard and then select these, go to View, and go down to Guides and go to Make Guides. And as soon as I do that, it takes those shapes and transforms them into actual guides. So now I can actually use these shapes as the basis for my grid. I can also copy and paste guides. So if I go back and unlock these guides, I can select, just click and drag over the guides I have, roll over one of them by holding down Option, and I'm also going to hold down Shift so I can move them over. And this is why I did the margins first, so I knew where the margins were. But I can put those in and it automatically scoots those over, just duplicating them. Okay. Now, I'm pretty sure there's a way to rotate them as well, but what I'm going to do is kind of show another way to do it until I remember how to do it the other way. I've got the guides unlocked right now, so I'm going to duplicate this artboard. Put in my top margin. And I'm going to duplicate these boxes and bring them down. It looks just like objects. What I'm going to do is just simply rotate them. So we've got the rotate tool over here. I'm just going to click that and rotate them. So let's say I want to rotate this 30 degrees or so. I'm just rotating it counterclockwise, and I get my grid rotated. The problem with working like this is you'd have to use all of your text and everything at an angle too, so that would be a little bit tricky. If you do a text box, let's fish. say I rotate it 30 degrees. If I rotate this box, it doesn't rotate the text with it if I'm using the selection tool. So in order to rotate the text to the 30 degrees that I want, I'd have to use the rotate tool here or go over to the transform menu and put all this in. And then it'll rotate it. So you have to just remember you either have to use the rotate tool or the transform menu to rotate it. But it gets a little bit tricky in that you're trying to work with your text at an angle. So that's why I recommend kind of figuring out your grid in a horizontal and vertical orientation first and then rotating it towards the end so you're not trying to work with all of your text at weird angles. But it is possible to rotate your grid like that. So are there any questions about developing your grid? It's a little bit more laborious in Illustrator, but it's probably a little bit easier to work with the text as objects. Like if you want to increase some of the type and make it larger, convert it to outline, so on and so forth, it's easier to do than that. InDesign, it'll be easier to work with the leading and the kerning and all that kind of stuff. You can do it in Illustrator, of course, but Illustrator is more about using objects than it is about using type. So one thing to note, though, is that you can work between the two. So just while I'm talking about it, let's say I am working with Helvetica. Let me lock these guides. Let's say I'm working with Helvetica and I want to work with the letter A. So I'm going to convert this to outlines. Won't let me. There we go. I'm going to convert this to outlines, and I'm going to use Illustrator to maybe take the counter space out. So I've done this in Illustrator. You can select an object, copy it, and then go to InDesign and paste it. So you can bring it in that way. So you might find it a little bit easier to actually work with objects in Illustrator and then bring it over into InDesign to actually work within your composition. And just like in Illustrator, you can scale this, you can change the color. Yeah. You mean like if it's, well, okay. Yes, I can do that. And this is another reason why InDesign can be a little bit better when working with text than Illustrator. Let's say I've got a paragraph of text. I'm just going to fill it with placeholder text. If I were to take this text box and just put it right over the letter, it's obviously going to not do anything to the text. It'll just be the text on top of the letter. What I have to do is use something called text wrap. So with this object selected, I'm going to go up here to the top menu, and there's these boxes with lines going over them. So all of those are different text wrap options. Right now it's set to where there's no text wrap, so if I put text over this or under it, it's just going to ignore it. The option that Deward was talking about would be wrap around the object shape. So, and hopefully if this works, the text will actually get pushed out from the side of the letter A. So I'm going to click that option. And then when I bring the type over, you can see how the type is just right up against it. It's not going over. Make this a little bit bigger. So you can see as I move stuff over, it's actually getting pushed to the contour. Now one thing I'll want to do is try to add some padding to this. Let me see, there's several ways to do that. If I do Command B, it brings up the text frame options, and I can do different spacing for the text box, so it's actually adding some padding around the text box. To change the padding around the letter itself, you might have to actually mess with it manually. So what I've done is I've selected the letter with the direct selection tool. So the white arrow, and you'll get these little points that come up, the anchor points. And it actually shows up as light blue. If I take those points and just kind of move them away, it pushes all the text away with it. So it's basically manually adjusting the padding around the letter. So if you do the text right up against an object like that, especially if the object is very close in the type to the type color, you definitely want to have some kind of padding between the type and the image, because otherwise it gets really tough to read. It's just like having your text too close to the edge of the page. It makes it visually displeasing. Unless that's your intention, which with this project it shouldn't be your intention. Does that answer your question? There might be some other way to adjust the padding around the letter, but I don't know right off the top of my head. The other option you have is to do text wrap around the bounding box. So you have those light blue lines defining the contour of the letter. You've also got the darker blue box defining the actual box that the letter is enclosed in. So if I do wrap around the bounding box, then it'll use the bounding box as the boundary. But that's something, like I said before, it's a little bit easier to deal with the text wrap and things in InDesign than it is in Illustrator. Are there any other questions about the grids or using Illustrator versus InDesign? Okay. One other thing I wanted to talk about, well, I've got the computer up here, is developing color palettes. So like I mentioned before, at the beginning of the project, you are going to have 2 colors to work with plus black and white. And so your selection of the colors is going to be pretty important. And with the color palettes, I recommend that you start doing that in Illustrator. It's a little bit easier to actually put the colors up against one another and export a color palette in Illustrator than Photoshop or InDesign, I found. You have all these generic swatches in here. If you're going to make your own color palette, just get rid of these default ones, because if you just start using colors out of this, it'll look like you don't know what you're doing. You guys have taken drawing classes and worked in 2D, 3D design, so you should have a pretty good foundation in color. You guys can come up with really cool color palettes otherwise. No pressure. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to select all of these colors. Just hold down Shift to select as many as I want. I'm just going to click and drag them to the trash can and just leave white and black to start. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to I'll start out with a couple squares. And to figure out what color I'm going to work with, I'm going to go to the color palette, and I'm working in CMYK, so I'm just going to start adjusting some of the colors I want to work with. So maybe I want like a really bright fuchsia, a little hot pink basically, and then I want to find a color that might go well with it. And this is where the color wheel comes into play. You have to think about where your colors are relative to one another on the color wheel. So you know that 2 colors that are right next to one another on the color wheel are going to share a lot of the same visual elements that the other does. So if I have this pink with a true red, there's not enough variation in those colors to really tell a difference. So I know that if I'm going to use them and print them out, it's going to be, the difference between those 2 colors is going to be very, very subtle. However, if I choose a color on the opposite end of the color wheel from this pink, it's going to create a completely different situation. There's something in Illustrator called the color guide, and what this will allow you to do, it'll allow you to take a selected color. In this case, I've got the pink, and it'll let you see other colors that are situated in certain spots of the color wheel. So from the drop-down menu, I've got the complementary color. So for this pink, on the exact opposite of the color wheel is the green. And when I put those 2 up against one another, they'll start to vibrate a lot. So imagine you've got a layout, you've got hot pink as the background, and then a lot of your objects as the green. Are people going to want to look at it? No. They might actually get sick. It's going to vibrate a lot. So that's where some of these other options and using tints and shades comes in. So I've got this pink. This Illustrator option shows me a lot of different palettes based off of where the colors fall on the color wheel relative to my initial color. So I've got the complementary colors that are kind of broken into greens that are on the other 2 sides of the green. I've got split complementary. And so this one takes some greens that might be a little bit more pleasant to look at with the pink. So I've got a green that's got more yellow in it, and then a green that's got more blue in it. So already those are options that are a little bit nicer. There's also analogous colors, so similar to how I was looking at the pink with the red. Maybe I want to look at the pink with the purple, so I can see how those colors look. Basically, I can just use this to kind of try out different options. You've got the triad option. So this one, it's creating an equilateral triangle from the initial color I have. And since this is a magenta, it's giving me a yellow and a very cyan-like blue. So maybe I decide to pair it with the blue. So this is a really good thing to use to kind of see all the different options that you might have. You can actually bring up the whole wheel. So if you go down to this wheel right here, it'll bring up a new window, and you can actually see how the colors work on the color wheel. So if I go back to complementary, I can see where my color starts on the wheel and where the complementary color is, how the split complementary works, and so on and so forth. So it's a really neat thing to do. You can even drag your initial color around and see how these different color combinations change. So I've got a few different options to work from, but what I mentioned before is that you can work with tints of these colors. If you were going to actually print these out, let's say you were going to letterpress print these, you could tell the printer, well, I want these colors to be, certain colors to be 50% of the original saturation. So what the printer would do is take the color that you've given them and mix it with 50%, mix half of it with half the same amount of like a transparent white. And so that basically thins it out, makes the color less saturated, and still the same color, it's just less of it. You can simulate that in Illustrator pretty easily. So I'm going to take this pink and the green, and I'm going to start working with it in different tints. The first thing I'm going to do is, since I know these are the two colors I'm going to work with, I'm actually going to turn these into swatches. So in the Swatches palette, I'm going to go to the drop-down menu and go to New Swatch, and I'll name it Strawberry. Oh, and before I close it, I want to select Global Color. What that means is when I go back to my color palette, instead of it showing CMYK, it's now showing that color in its most saturated version on the right side, and then on the left side it's showing pure white. So now when I go to make adjustments to the color, it'll be variations of the color with an amount of white added to it. I'm going to do the same thing to the green. And this time I can actually just, it's another way of adding a swatch to a palette. I'm just going to click on the fill box and drag it to the Swatches palette. I'll double click on it to bring up the swatch options, and I'll call this Lime. I'm going to make it a global color. And I know it's a global color because it's got that white triangle cut out in the lower right corner. So I'm going to select these objects, make sure they're both in their respective global colors, and then I'm going to start duplicating these. So I'm going to select these, and I want to see how they're going to look at 90% of their original saturation, 80. So you can see with each one of these it's just getting lighter. All that's happening is more white is being added to it. So I'll do this all the way to 10%. So from here you can see how all those colors, how those two colors become tints. And so what this means is you can take, let's say, a 90% of the strawberry and a 40% of the lime and see how those look together. What you can also start to do now that I've got these two colors fully delineated is I can see how these would look if they were overlapping. So let me pull this to the side. And I'm also going to, since black is another color option, I'm going to do the same thing but with black. And actually, I'm going to show you guys another trick. Hopefully I don't completely overwhelm you. There is another way to quickly make these transitions. So with the black, I'm starting with pure black at the top, and then I'm going to have white at the bottom. And I want 9 transitions between these two shapes. There is a tool called the blend tool. So if I go down to my tool menu and click the blend tool, I'll start with the black, end with the white, and you can see the transitions that's made between the two colors. Now if I want that to be made between in blocks like I have with the other two colors, I'll double click on the menu here and change the spacing from smooth color to specified steps. So I have 9 divisions with the other colors, so I'll change that to 9. And so now when I click that, it'll give me those 9 boxes in between. So that's a really quick way to do those transitions. You can do the same thing with these. And then if I want to have access to these as blocks like I do for these, I go to Object and Expand, and it'll break them down into boxes. So pretty cool. Got 2 different ways of doing it. One is a lot easier than the other, obviously. But to see how these will all look when they're overlapping, what I'll do is just take each of these and overlap them slightly. I'll duplicate the black and bring that over as well. And then there's 2 ways of looking at this. One is to use an option called Overprint Preview. What overprint means is when you've got a printing set up and you've got 2 colors that go over one another, they can either overlap one another, and let's say the black is overlapping the red. You can set it so that the black actually cuts out the red. So when the black is right here, there's actually no red underneath it. If you do overprint, then this red will show up, and then the black will be put on top of it. So what you'll see is actually a combination of the red and the black together. Now, just a word of advice, if you are printing things out and you have type, you have text in anything, especially body text, you're going to want it in overprint. And that's because if you imagine having, let's say you've got a red box and you've got this type written in it. If you don't have this in overprint, then every spot where that black is going to have no red underneath. And what might happen, and I'm sure you guys have seen this, there'll be these really weird white edges around the type. And so this is offset. This is what happens when those two colors don't line up properly while it's being printed. And especially with tiny type, to avoid that, it's better to just have this so that it gets printed over it and you don't have to worry about misalignment. There's so many factors involved in printing that the idea of two colors lining up perfectly, especially if they're really, really small, is slim to none. So any type of tiny text, you'll want to have it in overprint. So to make sure you have your stuff in overprint, what you'll do is go to the attributes menu, at least in Illustrator. So I'm going to go to Window, go to Attributes, and you'll see this box that says Overprint Fill. So I'm just going to click that while I have all these selected. So right now, all of this is in overprint. Then I'm going to go to View and Overprint Preview. And so this simulates what it will look like when it's printed. Since all of these are in overprint, I see where all of those shapes overlap, and I see the colors that are created when they overlap. If, let's say I have this set of black boxes not in overprint fill, and I put these on top of the green, visually it looks like the black is pushing the green off of it. So when it goes to print, this is exactly how it's going to print. Even though this is a full green box, it's actually just being reduced to a little rectangle. So just to illustrate further, I'm going to take some type and put it on top, and I'm going to convert it to outlines because it's a little easier to see. So this is not in overprint right now, and you can see it a little bit. There's these kind of weird edges on the sides of the type. If I put this in overprint, all of those edges seem a lot smoother, a lot cleaner. And also what you'll notice is the type looks darker. So it's putting that black color on top of the colors behind it, and it actually makes the black look richer and deeper. So it makes it better to print when you have small type, and it also gives you a truer black. So those are two things to keep in mind. Even if this type were a color though, and usually you'll have your type either, usually if you're going to have body text, it'll be in a dark color. It's going to multiply it in the same way. So that's just something to keep in mind. The other way you can simulate how these colors will look when they're overlapping, I'll just do normal preview. The other option is to use the transparencies, And in this case, you'd want to do multiply, and it'll show you what those colors look like when they're overlapping. So those are just two different ways. Generally speaking, if you're doing a piece and you're having it sent to a letterpress printer or an offset printer, and they're using basically tubes of the color you're making, you'll want to put everything into overprint, or put the proper things into overprint. So that way, when they go to print it, they'll understand what's supposed to overlap, what's not. So let me go back and take these off of multiply. So if I know I want this 80% of the strawberry, and we'll take the green at 50% on top of it. Right now, the green circle, even though it's on top, it's in overprint, so it's adding those two colors together. Just keep in mind, if you don't want that to happen, you need to go back to your attributes and turn overprint fill off, so it knocks out the color beneath it. Also, another thing to keep in mind, if you have overprint and you have white, you cannot put white into overprint, and I think it'll give you a warning. So if I were to do white in overprint, white is always the paper color when it comes to printing, so it's just going to disappear. So white, rule number one, never put white in overprint, okay? Are there any, it's a lot of information at once, but I feel like it's better to kind of tell you this now, so the further you get along with color, you'll already know some of this terminology. Okay. So that's pretty much it. When you guys start working on your thumbnails, you'll do your thumbnails like I have on the board. So just generalize where text is going to go and use the different widths of, the different heights of the blocks to kind of define how big your type is going to be. And then also start thinking about color. So originally, you guys were going to have color palettes by after spring break. I want you guys to go ahead and start playing around with color between now and Thursday. So that way, if you have questions about things or still don't understand overprint, then we can kind of discuss them then. Okay? Why don't we take a 10-minute break, and then when we come back, we'll watch the movie.